In 1967, a man sat in a scrapyard in Camberwell and calmly sent out for fish and chips, while, a few feet away, his crew wired a victim to an old army generator. That detail is real. It came out in a court of law. And it points to something most people get completely wrong about London's crime families. The story everyone knows is the craze, the suits, the photographs, the glamour. But the craze were convicted of 2 killings. 2. One South London feud no one has probably never heard of cost 8 lives, including innocent strangers shot by mistake. The most famous London crime families were almost never the deadliest, and the truly dangerous ones survived not by being violent, but by making the law itself stop working. Across the next few hours, 10 families, 1 full century, from racecourse rackets to a crime boss, a judge branded untouchable. Section 1, The Blueprint, Derby Sabini, and the birth of the London crime family. London after the First World War was a restless, hungry place. Soldiers had come home to a city short on jobs and short on patience, and the one thing nobody seemed short on was the urge to gamble. Horse racing was booming. Greyhound tracks were opening across the country. Cash moved fast at every meeting, passing through the hands of bookmakers who set up stands at the trackside and took bets out in the open air. And wherever that much loose money gathers in one place, someone always turns up to take a slice of it. In 1920s London, that someone was Charles Sabini, better known across the underworld as Derby. Derby Sabini was born in 1888 in Saffron Hill, a cramped tangle of streets near Clerkenwell that everyone knew as Little Italy. The father was an Italian immigrant, the mother was British. Money was tight, schooling ended early, and by the age of 13 the young Sabini had left the classroom behind for good. A short run as a boxer came next, then work as a doorman in the rough drinking dens of Hoxton. That door work mattered more than anyone realised at the time. Standing at the entrance of a club, reading a room, spotting trouble before trouble started. All of that taught one lesson that would shape an entire career, the business of fear and how to sell protection from it. The reputation began with a single moment in 1920. Inside a pub called the Griffin on Saffron Hill, an enforcer tied to a rival outfit from South London insulted an Italian barmaid. Sabini stepped in and flattened the man where he stood. The story raced through Little Italy within days, and almost overnight a new figure was born, the local protector, the man who looked after Italians, looked after women, looked after the neighbourhood. That image of the neighbourhood guardian was no small thing. It would stay useful for the rest of a long and dangerous career, a friendly mask worn over a far harder face. Protection was where the real money sat, and the racecourse was the perfect hunting ground. The system was simple and cruel. Bookmakers needed a good spot to trade, a clear patch of ground known as a pitch, and they needed to be left alone to work. The Sabini crew supplied things the bookies already owned: chalk, betting lists, the little tools of the trade, and then demanded payment for them anyway. Refuse, and the stand might be smashed, the bookmaker roughed up, the day ruined. Agree, and the protection fee came off the top. At the biggest meetings, the Sabini gang controlled 5 or 6 of the best pitches and took roughly half of everything earned there. Pay up, or do not trade at all. At full strength, the firm numbered around 100 core members, and the talk on the street put the real figure far higher. The outfit drew on Little Italy's tight Italian community, and by long-standing reputation, it also leaned on hired blades brought in from elsewhere. Soon the Sabini name became tied to attacks with blades that left rivals marked for life. A quiet, ugly calling card understood by every bookmaker working south of London. A police officer of the day described the method without any drama at all. The Sabini men would stand side-on to a bookmaker so that the hammers tucked inside their coats stayed in plain view. No words were needed. The message did the talking. There was a clever piece of business behind the muscle too. Rather than fighting every group in the city, Sabini built an alliance with a powerful set of Jewish bookmakers led by a figure named Edward Emanuel. Italians and Jewish bookmakers, working hand in hand, gave the Sabini operation a reach and a steadiness that loose street gangs could never match. That partnership turned a neighbourhood crew into something closer to a small empire, with fingers in racecourses, drinking clubs, and gambling dens right across the south of England. Up in the Midlands, a rival had the very same idea. Billy Kimber ran the Birmingham Boys, sometimes called the Brummagem Boys, and Kimber wanted the southern racecourses every bit as badly as Sabini did. A collision was only a matter of time, and when it came, it gave the whole era its name, the racecourse battles. The most famous flashpoint landed on the 2nd of June 1921, on Coronation Cup Day, near Ewell by Epsom. The Birmingham side ambushed a group of Leeds bookmakers they believed had switched their loyalty over to the Sabini camp. The plan went badly wrong, and around 23 of the Birmingham men ended up in custody afterwards. Newspapers howled. The public demanded that the police do something about the gangs turning race days into open battlegrounds. Out of all that noise came a deal. A truce was struck between the two sides, said to have been settled over a single bottle. The Birmingham Boys would keep the Midlands and the North, and Sabini would take the South. With that handshake, Darby Sabini became the undisputed boss of racecourse trade across southern England, the man the press would later crown the king of the racecourse gangs. For a man who had left school at 13, it was a remarkable climb. Staying on top took more than fists. Sabini understood early that power is safest when it has friends in useful places, and a careful web was spun across judges, officials, and serving police. Charges came and went, but convictions were strangely hard to pin on the boss directly. Cases collapsed. Witnesses lost their memories or vanished altogether. Time and again the law reached for Darby Sabini and came away with empty hands. The public face was a study in calm. No flashy suits, no showing off. The usual outfit was a flat cap, a collarless shirt, a high-buttoned waistcoat, and a plain dark suit. The dress of an ordinary working man, not a kingpin. Around Little Italy, the nickname was Uncle Bob, and the stories told of a generous figure who looked after women, children, the needy, and the Catholic Church. Behind that gentle picture sat a man who reportedly carried a loaded weapon at all times and never hesitated to order a hiding for anyone who stepped out of line. That Gap, the kind neighborhood benefactor on one side, the ruler of a fear business on the other, became one of the defining tricks of the British crime boss, copied by almost everyone who followed. Power, though, breeds rivals on the inside as surely as on the outside. The Cortesi brothers, another family from Little Italy and former allies of the Sabinis, broke away and turned hostile. In November 1922, inside the Fratellanza Club on Eyre Street Hill in Clerkenwell, the feud boiled over. Harry Sabini, one of Darby's brothers, was wounded in the stomach when the Cortesis opened fire. Two of them, Augustus and Enrico Cortesi, were later convicted over the attack. At the trial, the judge, Justice Darling, summed the whole sorry affair up by comparing it to the Montagues and the Capulets, the warring families of Romeo and Juliet, old immigrant clans locked in a bitter cycle of revenge on the streets of London. Then came the strangest fall imaginable for a man so feared. In 1924, a weekly paper called the Topical Times, owned by the publisher D.C. Thompson, printed an article naming Sabini as a racecourse gang leader. Stung, Sabini decided to sue the newspaper for libel. The decision turned into a disaster. On the day of the action, the great racecourse king failed even to appear in court, reportedly because the cost of a solicitor, a sum of £75, was beyond reach. The case was lost. Costs of £775 were ordered against him. The bill went unpaid, and bankruptcy followed. The boss, who had survived blades, ambushes, and rival families, was finally brought low by a newspaper and a courtroom. Leadership of the family drifted toward another brother, Harry, known as Harry Boy, and the Sabini grip began to loosen. The late 1920s pressed in from every side. In 1929, the Jockey Club and the Bookmakers Protection Association brought in new rules that cut hard into the old racecourse rackets, draining away the easy money that had built the empire. Sabini shifted sideways to survive, moving into greyhound tracks and the drinking and gambling clubs of the West End. The reach was still there, but the golden years were clearly slipping into the past. History delivered the final blow. In 1940, Italy entered the Second World War on the opposing side, and overnight men of Italian descent across Britain fell under suspicion. That April, Darby Sabini was arrested at Hove Greyhound Stadium and interned as what the law of the day called an enemy alien, locked away despite a British mother and despite being unable to speak a word of Italian. Release came in 1941. Then, in 1943, a fresh conviction for receiving stolen goods brought a sentence of 3 years. The war took a deeper toll still. A son was lost while serving with the Royal Air Force. The proud Little Italy boss was, by then, a fading name. By the time the war ended, the old empire had already passed into new hands. The rackets first fell under the control of the White family, led by Alf White, and then into the grip of the next generation of London bosses, Jack Spot and Billy Hill, who would rule the West End through the years that followed. Darby Sabini himself settled quietly into life in Hove, working as a small-time bookmaker, the king of the racecourse gangs reduced to an ordinary figure standing at the rails, watching the trade that had once been an empire. The end came on the 4th of October 1950. Look closely at everything that came afterwards, and the same shape keeps appearing. Almost every London crime family of the next 80 years was built on the pattern Darby Sabini set down first. A blood family at the centre of the operation. A clearly marked territory to defend. Protection and extortion as the engine that paid for everything else. Alliances stitched across different communities to widen the reach. Friends quietly bought inside the police and the courts to blunt the law. And, sitting over all of it, a warm public mask of charity and good manners pulled across a cold private trade in fear. That blueprint did not fade with the racecourse era. The names that would later terrify the city all worked from the very same plan, whether they knew the source or not. The legend found a strange second life long after the man was gone. The television series Peaky Blinders cast Darby Sabini as a major rival to its fictional heroes, played by the actor Noah Taylor, and built another character, the bookmaker Alfie Solomon, around a real Sabini associate named Alfred Solomon. Millions of viewers met a sharp-suited, fast-talking screen version of the racecourse king without ever learning the harder, stranger truth of the actual life behind it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Darby Sabini drew the map of organised crime in London, but the post-war underworld would be carved up by hungrier hands. Just west of the old East End, around Islington and the bright lights of the West End, a new family was rising, one whose name would soon be tied to one of the most notorious night spot incidents of the entire era. What happened in a small members club in the early hours of one cold morning in 1960 would expose just how far these families were willing to go to keep the law at bay. Section 2. The Vanishing Witnesses, the Nash family, and the Pen Club killing. There were around 7 of them, a tight knot of brothers raised in the working-class streets near the Angel in Islington, and by the 1950s, they were one of the most powerful families in North London. Their name was Nash. The elder statesman of the clan was Johnny Nash, a steady, respected figure in the underworld, who would still be turning up at gangland funerals decades later as one of the last surviving links to the old days. But the brother whose name became tied to one of the most notorious club shootings of the era was Jimmy Nash. Where Johnny carried himself as a calm fixer, Jimmy had the harder, more dangerous reputation, and it was Jimmy who would end up in the dock of the Old Bailey facing the gallows. To understand how the Nash family rose, it helps to understand the city they rose into. By the 1950s, the man sitting at the top of London crime was Billy Hill, a career criminal from a large family in central London who had stabbed his first victim at the age of 14 and built a fearsome name through smash-and-grab raids, smuggling, and protection rackets. Hill called himself the boss of Britain's underworld, and for a stretch of the post-war years, that title was no boast. But no boss rules forever, and a city this size always had room for hungry families pushing up from the streets below. The Nash family were among the hungriest. To understand how the Nash family worked, it helps to understand the trade they were in, because it was the very same trade Darby Sabini had built his empire on 30 years earlier: protection. The basic version of the racket was crude. A group of heavies would walk into a pub or a club, smash the place up, frighten the staff and the customers, then come back a few days later and quietly offer to make sure nothing like that ever happened again, for a weekly fee, of course. But the Nash family, working alongside an associate named Joey Pyle, ran a smarter version of it. They did not need to wreck a venue to make their point. The reputation did the work. A club owner who knew exactly who the Nash brothers were and exactly what they were capable of, would often pay up the moment they walked through the door. Fear, sold by the weak. That was the engine. The map of London at the time was carved up between several powers. Out in the East End, the Cray twins were building their empire. Down south of the river, the Richardson family and a hard man named Freddie Foreman held sway. And in the slice of the city between them, Islington and the bright, money-soaked streets of the West End, it was the Nash family and Joey Pyle who ran things. Different families, different patches, an uneasy peace held together by mutual respect and mutual fear. That balance is exactly what makes the events of one cold winter night so important, because it shows what happened when the peace broke down. The story turns on a man named Selwyn Keith Cooney. Cooney was 31 years old and ran in the same circles as the big names. He managed a club on Gerrard Street in the West End called the New Cabinet Club, and the man who owned that club was none other than Billy Hill himself. So Cooney was not some random face. He was connected to the most powerful underworld figure of the decade. That connection matters because the killing that followed was not a street mugging gone wrong. It was business, and it was personal. In the early hours of the 7th of February 1960, the action moved to a small members' club called the Pen Club. The Pen Club sat on Duval Street, near the Great Spitalfields Market on the eastern edge of the city. Like a lot of these places, it was a late-night drinking spot where underworld figures mixed. And like a lot of these places, it was the kind of room where a disagreement could turn deadly in seconds. On that night, after a brawl broke out, Selwyn Cooney was shot and killed inside the club. A 31-year-old man gunned down in a members' club in the small hours of the morning. The killing sent a shockwave through the London underworld and straight onto the front pages. The police investigation pointed toward the Nash camp, and 3 men were eventually brought to trial at the Old Bailey in April 1960 over the death. They were Jimmy Nash, Joey Pyle, the Nash family associate, and a third man named James Reed. The charge was the most serious in the land. At that time, Britain still carried out hanging for certain kinds of unlawful killing, and the men in the dock knew exactly what was at stake. If the jury found them guilty of the worst charge, the sentence could be death. Joey Pyle understood this completely. On the very day of the killing, the Cray twins reportedly offered to help the 3 men slip out of the country, but they chose to stay and face the court. It was a decision made with the shadow of the gallows hanging over them. And here is where the case becomes one of the most revealing stories in the whole history of London's crime families. Because what happened next was not really about the evidence at all. It was about power, specifically the power of an underworld family to reach inside a courtroom and bend the justice system until it broke. The first trial fell apart. It did not fall apart because the case was weak. It fell apart because the people who were supposed to make it work were got at, one by one. Members of the jury, the ordinary citizens whose only job was to listen to the evidence and decide, were approached and leaned on. That alone is enough to wreck a trial, because a jury that has been tampered with cannot be trusted to deliver a fair verdict. But the pressure went much further than the jury. 2 key witnesses, a man named Johnny Simons and his girlfriend Barbara Ibbotson, had their faces cut open. Each of them needed 27 stitches. Think about that for a second. 27 stitches each, as a message, delivered before they could give their account in court. 2 people marked for life simply for being witnesses. There was a third witness too, and her story is just as telling. A woman named Faye Sadler had originally picked one of the accused out at an identification parade, meaning she had pointed to a suspect and said, "That is the man." Faye Sadler was no innocent bystander to this world. She had been connected to the Pen Club and to Cooney himself, and she knew exactly how dangerous the people around her could be. Before the trial could properly use her evidence, she vanished, disappeared completely. The single witness whose identification could have nailed the case down simply stopped existing as far as the court was concerned. A jury got at, 2 witnesses slashed, a third witness gone like smoke. With the trial collapsing into chaos under the weight of all this interference, the judge had no choice. Only 4 days into the proceedings, Mr. Justice Gorman stopped the whole thing. The reason he gave was carefully worded but unmistakable in its meaning. He told the court that certain information had been brought to his notice, which made it impossible for the case to continue in front of that jury. In plain language, Somebody had poisoned the well so thoroughly that a fair trial was no longer possible. The jury was dismissed. The first attempt at justice had been beaten, not by a clever defense, but by raw intimidation. A second trial followed. By the time it came around, the prosecution's case had been gutted. Against two of the men, Reed and Pyle, the prosecution offered no evidence at all on the killing charge, and the two were formally found not guilty of it. The case against Jimmy Nash, the man alleged to have carried the revolver, had also been badly damaged by all the missing and frightened witnesses. In the end, Jimmy Nash was cleared of the most serious charge, the one that could have sent him to the gallows. The shooting of Selwyn Cooney officially went down as an unsolved killing. To this day, no one has ever been held fully to account for his death in the way the law intended. But the story did not end with everyone walking free. The three men were then tried on a lesser set of charges, connected to the violence that led up to the shooting, causing actual bodily harm to Cooney before he was killed. On that, the outcome was different. Jimmy Nash was convicted and sentenced to 5 years. Joey Pyle was given a sentence of 18 months for his part in assaulting Cooney. So the law did land a blow, just a far smaller one than the killing itself deserved. The family had absorbed the hit and survived largely intact. The lesson the whole affair taught the authorities was a hard one, and it changed how policing worked. The Cooney case made it brutally clear that the old way of doing things, relying on frightened witnesses and ordinary juries against organized crime families, was not enough. These families could find witnesses, could find jurors, and could apply the kind of pressure that no amount of courtroom procedure could withstand on its own. The case is widely credited as one of the events that pushed Scotland Yard towards setting up a dedicated criminal intelligence operation, a unit built specifically to gather information on organized crime over the long term, rather than scrambling to react after each fresh killing. In other words, the Nash family did not just beat one trial, they forced the police to rethink the entire way they fought the underworld. Step back and look at what the Pen Club killing reveals, and it is the same blueprint from the Sabini era, only sharper and more frightening. A crime family built on protection rackets, a defended patch of territory, and, when the law came knocking, the ability to corrupt and terrify the justice system into silence. Darby Sabini had quietly bought friends inside the courts and watched cases melt away. The Nash family did it out in the open, with blades and threats, and the result was the same, the boss walking free. The tools had become more violent, but the playbook had not changed. The Nash name carried on long after that night. Johnny Nash, the elder brother and steady hand of the family, lived for decades more and remained a figure of genuine respect across the underworld, turning up among the old guard at the funerals of the men he had once shared the city with. The family proved something important about how these clans survived. They did not need to be the loudest or the flashiest. They needed to be feared enough that witnesses lost their voices and jurors lost their nerve. That quiet, deadly competence kept the Nash family near the top of London's underworld through one of its most dangerous decades. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Yet for all their power, the Nash family never became household names beyond the world they moved in. They were known to the police, known to rival families, known to the people who paid them, but the wider public barely registered them. That was about to change for a different pair of brothers across town in the East End. Two identical twins were building something the Nash family never wanted and never sought: fame. And it was that hunger for the spotlight, as much as the violence behind it, that would turn them into the most recognized names in the entire history of British crime. Section 3. The Brothers Who Wanted to be Famous. The Rise and Fall of the Crays. Ronald and Reginald Cray were born on the 24th of October 1933 in the East End of London, Reggie arriving 10 minutes ahead of Ronnie. They would become, more than half a century later, the most recognised names in the entire history of British crime, and they remain so today, not because they killed the most people or ran the biggest operation, but because they wanted something no London family had ever truly chased before them. They wanted to be famous. They wanted their photographs in the papers. They wanted to be seen at the best clubs, shaking hands with film stars and singers. And for a few short years in the 1960s, they got everything they asked for. The family settled at 178 Valence Road in Bethnal Green, a modest house in a tough, tight-knit corner of the city. where the boys grew up alongside their older brother Charlie. Their father dealt in second-hand clothes and gold door to door. Their mother, Violet, doted on her twins, and the bond between the three brothers and their mother would last their whole lives. As young men, the twins were boxers, and good ones. The East End was full of boxing clubs, and the Krays threw themselves into the sport, even turning professional for a short spell as teenagers. But any chance of a clean career in the ring ended when the country came calling. Like all young British men of the time, the twins were ordered to do national service in the army in the early 1950s. They wanted nothing to do with it. They ignored orders, went absent, and racked up spells in military custody. They even spent time locked inside the Tower of London. After a military trial, both were thrown out of the army in disgrace. By then the path was set. Instead of becoming boxers, they became something else entirely. The brothers took over a run-down billiard hall on the Mile End Road and turned it into the base of operations for their gang, which they called the Firm. From there they ran the same trade that had powered London's families for decades: protection. Pubs, clubs and businesses across the East End paid the Firm to be left in peace, and those who refused learned quickly why paying was the wiser choice. The twins built a reputation for sudden, frightening violence. Reggie had a signature move that became almost legendary. He would offer a man a cigarette, and the instant the man pushed his jaw forward to take it, Reggie would strike, breaking the jaw clean. Small, cruel, and effective. It told everyone exactly what kind of men they were dealing with. But the protection rackets were only half the story, and arguably the less interesting half. What truly set the Krays apart from every family that came before them was their hunger for the spotlight. They opened and ran clubs in the fashionable West End, and through those clubs they mixed with a glittering crowd. Actors, singers, sporting heroes, and members of high society passed through their world, and the twins made sure they were photographed alongside them. The famous fashion photographer David Bailey took their portrait. They sat for television interviews. For a brief, dazzling moment, two gangsters from Bethnal Green became part of the swinging London scene, treated almost like celebrities in their own right. That fame served a purpose. The more the public saw the twins rubbing shoulders with stars, the harder it became to see them as ordinary criminals. The glamour acted as a shield. It also made witnesses even more reluctant to speak against them, because the Krays now looked untouchable, well-connected, well-known, and protected by their own legend. It was the old Sabini trick of the friendly public mask, taken to a level no London family had ever reached. Where Derby Sabini handed out money to the church and the poor of Little Italy, the Krays handed the newspapers a parade of star-studded photographs. The effect was the same. The frightening reality hid behind a pleasant picture. Behind that picture, though, the violence was building toward two killings that would eventually destroy everything the twins had created. The first came on the 9th of March 1966. The target was a man named George Cornell, and the choice of victim mattered. Cornell had once moved in East End circles, but he had gone over to the Krays' great rivals south of the river, the Richardson family. There was bad blood between Cornell and Ronnie Kray, fed by insults and threats that had passed between the two camps. On that March evening, Cornell made the mistake of drinking in a pub called the Blind Beggar on the Whitechapel Road, squarely in Kray territory. Word reached Ronnie that his enemy was sitting in his manor, out in the open, and Ronnie decided to act. What happened next was almost casual in its boldness, and that is precisely why it shook the underworld so hard. Ronnie Kray walked into the Blind Beggar at around 8:30 in the evening, accompanied by an associate named Ian Barry. Barry fired shots into the ceiling as a warning to everyone present. Then Ronnie walked up to George Cornell, pulled out a pistol, and shot him in the head at close range. Cornell slumped against a pillar and was taken to hospital, where he died. Ronnie and Barry simply turned, walked out, and were driven away. The shocking part was not just the killing, it was the openness of it. Ronnie Kray had walked into a public house, in front of a barmaid and other drinkers, and shot a man dead. Most underworld killings were done quietly, in the dark, by people who could never be traced. The mafia contacts the Krays had cultivated were reportedly horrified, seeing it as reckless to shoot a man in public rather than handing the job to some junior who could disappear. But here is the thing that made it work, at least for a while. Nobody would talk. The witnesses in that pub were so frightened of the Krays that not one of them was willing to point the finger. The barmaid had seen it happen, so had others. And still the case went nowhere, because fear had sealed every mouth in the room. For the Krays, that silence was proof of just how powerful they had become. The second killing, the one that finished the brothers off, came the following year. By October 1967, Reggie Kray was a wounded man. His young wife, Frances, had taken her own life only months earlier, and Reggie was reportedly grieving and unstable. Ronnie, who had already taken a life, is widely said to have pushed his brother to do the same, as if a killing each would somehow bind them closer together. The victim was a small-time member of their own gang, Jack McVitie, known as Jack the Hat, because of the trilby he wore to cover his thinning hair. McVitie had been paid in advance to carry out a job for the twins, and had failed to do it, then made matters far worse by keeping the money and boasting about cheating the Krays. To men who ruled through fear, that kind of disrespect could not be allowed to stand. McVitie was lured to a basement flat on Evering Road in Stoke Newington, under the impression he was coming to a party. Instead, he walked into a trap. Reggie put a gun to him and pulled the trigger, but the weapon failed to fire. What followed was a frenzied, brutal attack with a knife that left McVitie dead in the basement. His body was taken away and disposed of, and to this day, it has never been found. That second killing set in motion the chain of events that brought the whole empire crashing down. The man who finally caught the Krays was a determined Scotland Yard detective named Leonard Reed, known throughout the force as Nipper. Reed had been on the twins for years and had got nowhere. For the same reason every other officer had failed. Witnesses were too terrified to testify. But Reed understood the real problem. As long as the Krays were free and frightening, nobody would talk. So he built his case patiently, and crucially, he worked to convince potential witnesses that this time, the twins would not be coming back to punish them. The twins were arrested on the 8th of May 1968. Once they were safely locked up and clearly going nowhere, the dam broke. One by one, members of the firm and frightened witnesses began to talk, now that the shadow of Kray vengeance had lifted. The barmaid from The Blind Beggar was given protection and finally gave her account of the Cornell shooting. People who had stayed silent for years found their voices. The very fear that had protected the Krays for so long evaporated the moment they were behind bars, and the case against them grew overwhelming. The trial ran from January to March 1969 at the Old Bailey and became a genuine sensation. It was the longest hearing of its kind in British legal history up to that point. Demand to watch was so intense that people were paying for seats in the public gallery just to witness the spectacle. On the 8th of March 1969, after the jury had deliberated, both brothers were found guilty of the killings. The judge, Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson, handed down a sentence that was extraordinary for its severity: life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they serve no less than 30 years. He summed up his view of them in a single cutting line, saying that society had earned a rest from their activities. Their older brother Charlie was also convicted for his part in dealing with McVitie's body and was sentenced to 10 years. 30 years. It was far longer than the usual term, and it was meant to send a message that no amount of fame or fear could place a person above the law. The brothers who had wanted to be famous got their wish in the most permanent way possible. They became immortal in the public memory, but they spent the rest of their lives locked away. Ronnie, whose mental health had long been fragile, was eventually certified insane and moved to Broadmoor, a secure hospital, where he remained until he died of a heart attack on the 17th of March, 1995. Reggie served more than 3 decades and was finally released in August 2000 on compassionate grounds, gravely ill with cancer. He died only weeks later. The twins are buried in East London, and their graves still draw visitors. Here is the strange thing about the Krays, and the reason their story matters far beyond the body count. Other London families killed more people. Other families ran bigger operations and made more money. But none of them captured the public imagination the way these two did, and that captured imagination is itself a kind of warning. Films were made about them, books poured out for decades. The myth grew so large that many people came to remember the Krays as charming rogues, gangsters with manners who only ever hurt their own kind. The reality was a public shooting in a crowded pub, and a man stabbed to death in a basement, his body never recovered for his family to bury. The glamour was always a mask, exactly as it had been since the days of Derby Sabini. The craze simply wore it better than anyone before or since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the twins were busy collecting headlines and celebrity friends in the East End, their bitter rivals across the river were building something colder and, by some accounts, far more frightening. The Richardson family did not chase fame. They had no interest in being photographed. What they had instead was a reputation for a particular kind of cruelty, one that earned their crew a nickname that still makes people wince, and led to a courtroom case that would expose methods almost too grim to believe. Section 4. The Torture Gang. Charlie Richardson and the cruelty south of the River Charlie. And Eddie Richardson ran South London from a scrapyard in Camberwell, and in their own world they were every bit as powerful as the most famous gangsters in the city, and, by the account of many who knew both, considerably more frightening to cross. They wanted none of the spotlight. There were no photographs with film stars, no television interviews, no carefully managed public image. The Richardsons worked in the shadows, and their methods were so grim that the press gave them a name that has stuck for nearly 60 years. The Torture Gang. Charlie Richardson, the elder and the brains of the operation, was born in 1934 in Camberwell, a working-class district of South London. Like so many of these men, he and his younger brother Eddie grew up scrapping as boys and turned to crime as adults. The family business, on the surface, was scrap metal. Charlie ran a scrapyard in Camberwell, and Eddie ran a sideline in fruit machines, the coin-operated gaming devices found in pubs and clubs. But these businesses were never really about scrap or slot machines. They were fronts, respectable-looking covers for a sprawling criminal operation built on fraud, theft, handling stolen goods, lending money at crushing rates, and the familiar engine of protection rackets. The way Eddie ran the fruit machine business gives a clear picture of how the family operated. He would visit a pub landlord and suggest, in a friendly enough manner, that the landlord might like to install one of his gaming machines. It was not really a suggestion. A landlord who said no risked a beating and a wrecked pub. A landlord who said yes found himself paying the Richardsons a cut for the privilege. The choice in the end was no choice at all: pay up or suffer. The same pressure ran through everything the family touched, from the market traders to the gambling operators across their patch of South London. Their territory was substantial. The Richardson reach stretched from the scrapyards of South London out to clubs in the West End, and the family's interests reportedly extended as far as mining ventures in South Africa. There were even strange, murky stories tying Charlie to the South African Intelligence Service and to a scheme involving an attempt to listen in on the telephone of the British Prime Minister of the day, Harold Wilson. Whether every one of those tales is true is hard to say, but they capture the scale of the ambition. This was not a small neighbourhood crew. It was a serious enterprise with fingers in many pies. There was one more strand to the Richardson operation that set it apart, and it reached back to the most famous robbery in British history. In August 1963, a gang stopped a mail train in the countryside and made off with a fortune in cash, in what became known forever as the Great Train Robbery. The men behind that raid moved in the same circles as the Richardson brothers, and one of the family's future enforcers was reportedly invited to take part. He turned the offer down, only because he was on the run from the police at the time and judged it too risky. That near miss says a great deal about the company the Richardsons kept. These were not isolated South London thugs. They were plugged into the very top tier of British organised crime, connected to the men who pulled off the most audacious theft the country had ever seen. The Richardson Manor may have been built on scrapyards and fruit machines, but its reach touched the biggest names in the underworld of the day. What truly set the Richardsons apart, though, was not the size of the operation. It was the cruelty of how they enforced it, and the most feared figure in that enforcement was a man named Frankie Fraser. Frankie Fraser was born in Lambeth, South London, in 1923, and by the time he joined the Richardsons in the early 1960s, he had already spent much of his life in and out of custody. Over his lifetime, he would spend somewhere between 40 and 42 years behind bars, a staggering total that tells its own story. Fraser's path to the Richardsons had been long and brutal. Born into poverty in South London, he had turned to crime as a child and spent the war years and the decades that followed cycling endlessly through the prison system, building a reputation as one of the most violent and uncontrollable men in the country. He had been certified insane more than once. He had worked, at various points, with the biggest underworld figures of the previous generation. By the time he attached himself to the Richardson brothers in the early 1960s, he was already a legend of a grim kind. A man whose name alone could end an argument. What sealed his loyalty to the Richardsons was a favor. When the police came sniffing after the Great Train robbery, the brothers were said to have used their influence to keep Fraser out of the frame. From then on, he was theirs, and he became the sharpest instrument of fear the family possessed. Fraser became the Richardsons' chief enforcer, the man they sent for when someone needed to be dealt with. He earned a nickname that captured his particular speciality in the most chilling way possible. They called him the Dentist because of his habit of pulling out his victims' teeth with a pair of pliers. He was said to carry a gold-plated pair on him. The Richardsons developed a whole grim routine for punishing anyone they believed had cheated them, informed on them, or shown them disrespect. It was a kind of twisted courtroom. The victim would be brought to the scrapyard or another quiet location and put through what amounted to a mock trial, with Eddie acting as the prosecutor, laying out the supposed crime, and Charlie sitting in judgment. Once the verdict was handed down, the punishment began. The methods described later in court were almost too grim to take in. Victims were beaten over many hours. Some were burned with cigarettes. Some had teeth pulled. The gang used an old hand-cranked electrical generator, a device originally built to send distress signals from aircraft, which Charlie had salvaged from a scrapped wartime bomber broken up at his yard. An associate named Roy Hall would work the handle, sending electric shocks through the victim's body. There was one more detail to the routine that somehow made the whole thing even darker. After the punishment was over, victims were often handed a clean shirt to wear home, because their own clothing was soaked in blood. This grim courtesy gave the practice its underworld name. Being put through the Richardson treatment became known as taking a shirt from Charlie. And in a detail that says everything about how casually these men treated the suffering of others, witnesses later described how Charlie would send one of his men out for fish and chips when he got hungry partway through a session. It is worth pausing on one important point of honesty here, because the truth matters more than the legend. In later years, Frankie Fraser himself claimed that the torture stories had been exaggerated. He dismissed some of the more lurid accounts and argued that, by the standards of a later era, the gang might never even have been charged. So there is a genuine debate about exactly how far every story stretched. But the core of it was established in a court of law, on sworn testimony from named victims, and the picture that emerged was damning enough without any embellishment at all. This was a family that ruled through fear of real, deliberate, sustained physical cruelty. For all their power, the Richardsons were not undone by a grand police operation or a single dramatic raid. The first real crack in their armor came from an ordinary victim who simply refused to stay silent. In the summer of 1965, a man who had been assaulted by Charlie Richardson and Frankie Fraser walked into a police station and reported what had been done to him. It was an act of genuine courage, because everyone in that world understood the price of informing on the Richardsons. That single complaint became a thread, and as detectives began to pull on it, more victims slowly found the nerve to come forward. This is the quiet pattern beneath so many of these stories. The mighty firms, for all their menace, were often brought down not by clever policing alone, but by the moment one frightened person decided they had suffered enough. The Richardson empire ruled through the certainty that no one would ever talk. It began to fall the day someone did. The thing that finally broke the Richardsons was not, in the first instance, the torture. It was a gun battle that erupted out of the rivalry between the South London family and the Krays across the river. The two camps had been circling each other for a long time. There was bad blood, fed in large part by George Cornell, the man who had crossed over from East End circles to the Richardson side and who traded insults and threats with Ronnie Kray. In the early hours of one night in March 1966, members of both camps ended up in the same place, a club in Catford called Mr. Smith's. What began as drinking turned into a brawl, and the brawl turned into gunfire. A man connected to the Kray camp, Richard Hart, was shot dead. Frankie Fraser was wounded in the leg. Eddie Richardson was also shot and injured. The shootout at Mr. Smith's was a disaster for the family because it dragged them into the open and brought the full weight of the police down on them. The very next night, that same feud produced its most famous casualty when Ronnie Cray walked into the Blind Beggar and shot George Cornell dead, a killing covered in the previous part of this story. 2 violent deaths inside 48 hours, springing from the same poisoned rivalry. The bloodshed could no longer be ignored. The end came quickly after that. On the 30th of July 1966, a date burned into English memory for an entirely different reason, because it was the day the national football team won the World Cup. Police staged dawn raids across South London and arrested Charlie Richardson. Over the following days, the rest of the gang was rounded up. The authorities had been building a case for some time, helped along by victims who had finally found the courage to come forward, and by a former gang member named Johnny Bradbury, who became a key witness. Getting witnesses to talk had never been easy against a family this feared, and several of them, along with members of the jury, had to be placed under police protection once the case began. The trial opened at the Old Bailey at the beginning of April 1967 and became known forever as the torture trial. 8 members of the gang stood in the dock, including both Richardson brothers and Frankie Fraser, facing charges that included fraud, extortion, false imprisonment, and serious assault. The prosecutor, Sebag Shaw, set the tone in his opening words, telling the jury that the case was about violence, not sudden, heat-of-the-moment violence, but brutal violence, carried out in a systematic, cold, and ruthless way. Then came the testimony. One after another, victims described what had been done to them. A man named Benjamin Colston told the court how Frankie Fraser had put pliers into his mouth and tried to pull out his teeth, slipping and tearing away part of his gum and a piece of a tooth in the process. The details were so grim and so calmly delivered that the case became a national sensation. The verdicts landed hard. The gang members were found guilty. Charlie Richardson, judged the mastermind of the whole operation, was sentenced to 25 years, an enormous term, even longer at the time than what some of his contemporaries received. Eddie Richardson, who had already been dealt with separately for the affray at Mr. Smith's, had further years added on top. Frankie Fraser, the dentist, was sentenced to 10 years for his role. The torture gang was finished. Charlie Richardson would not walk free until July 1984, having served the better part of 2 decades. Ever the showman in his own quiet way, he made headlines again in 1980 when he escaped from an open prison and spent nearly a year on the run, at one point reportedly dressing as Father Christmas and handing out presents to children to draw attention to his campaign for release. Step back, and the Richardson story makes a sharp and uncomfortable point about how these families are remembered. The Crays are the household name. Films get made about them. Their faces sell books and merchandise to this day. The Richardsons, by contrast, are far less known to the general public, and yet many of the people who lived through that era, including police officers who dealt with both gangs, believed the Richardsons were the more dangerous of the two. A former senior detective put it plainly, saying the Richardsons were the real frighteners, genuinely vicious people. The lesson is simple but important. Fame and danger are not the same thing. The family that wanted to be seen became legends. The family that worked in the dark was, by some measures, worse, and history has very nearly forgotten them. That gap between reputation and reality runs through this entire story. There is also a quieter point buried in the Richardson case, one that would echo through every chapter still to come. Charlie Richardson openly boasted that he had police officers in his pocket, and later evidence confirmed that bribery of officers was widespread in the London of that era. For years, that corruption had helped shield the gang from proper investigation. The Richardsons did not just rule through torture. They ruled, in part, because some of the people meant to stop them had been bought. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fall of the Crays and the Richardsons within a couple of years of each other tore the heart out of the old order. 2 of the most powerful families in London were suddenly gone, their leaders locked away for decades. But crime does not vanish when its kings are jailed. It simply waits for someone new to step into the empty space. What rose next did not look much like the old neighbourhood firms at all. It came not from the famous East End or the feared South, but from a single working-class family with a name that would one day be spoken of as the most powerful and the most untouchable that London had ever produced. Section 5. The Untouchables, the Addams family and the limits of the law. 3 brothers, born into a family of 11 children to Irish parents in Barnsbury, a working-class part of Islington, built what police came to regard as the most powerful criminal organisation Britain has ever produced. Their name was Addams, and for decades they were spoken of as the family the law simply could not touch. The eldest of the trio, and the one regarded as the brains of the whole operation, was Terence Addams, Terry, born on the 18th of October 1954. Alongside him stood his brothers Tommy and Patrick, the latter usually known as Patsy. In the rough shorthand of those who knew them, Terry was the level-headed planner, Tommy handled the money, and Patsy was the unpredictable one, the muscle. Together, they would become known across the underworld and in the press as the Addams family, or the A-Team, and their operation was given a more formal name too, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, after the part of North London where it was based. They had learned a hard lesson from watching the famous firms of earlier decades fall. The surest way to stay free was to stay invisible. No celebrity friends, no interviews, no photographs, and no boss anywhere near the actual violence. The brothers started exactly where every London family before them had started, at the bottom, with petty crime, extortion from market traders, shakedowns, the small, grubby business of squeezing money out of people too frightened to refuse. But the Addams brothers did not stay small. Over the course of the 1980s they climbed, and by the time they reached the top their interests reportedly spanned drug trafficking on a large scale, the hijacking of valuable shipments, fraud, and the laundering of vast sums of dirty money into clean-looking businesses. Media reports came to credit the family with a fortune of up to £200 million. Whether that figure is accurate is impossible to confirm, but it captures the scale of what the family was believed to control. Here, though, an important note of honesty is needed, because the Addams story is wrapped in more legend than almost any other in this entire account. The family has been linked in the press and in police briefings to as many as 25 killings over the years. The word linked is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Almost none of those deaths has ever been proven against the family in a court of law. Police officers themselves, speaking off the record to newspapers, have admitted that the Addams name became so feared that the family was credited with crimes it may never have actually committed. The reputation took on a life of its own, so everything that follows should be understood with that warning attached. This is a story where the fear was enormous, the convictions were few, and the line between fact and folklore is genuinely blurred. That gap is not a weakness in the story. It is the heart of it. What made the Addams family so dangerous was not loud violence. It was a careful, deliberate structure designed to keep the bosses clean. The model worked like this. Terry Addams, the man at the top, kept himself at a distance from any actual crime. Orders flowed down, money flowed up. But the dirty work, the threats, the violence, the deals, was handled several layers below, by enforcers and associates who could be sacrificed if things went wrong. If a body was never going to be traced back to the man who ordered the killing, then the man who ordered the killing could never be charged. A prosecutor at one of the family's later court hearings summed up this method precisely, describing Terry Addams as someone whose hallmark was the ability to keep his distance from the violence and other crime that he nonetheless profited from. It was insulation, built on purpose, and for a very long time it worked. The fear the family generated was real, and a couple of cases from the late 1990s show why their reputation was so fearsome, and also why so little of it ever reached a courtroom. The two names that come up again and again are Solly Nahome and Gilbert Winter. Solly Nahome was a diamond merchant from Hatton Garden, the historic centre of London's jewellery trade, which sits right in the family's Clerkenwell heartland. Nahome was believed by police to act as a financial advisor to the syndicate, the man who took the dirty money and washed it clean through the jewellery business and other ventures. In 1998, Solly Nahome was shot dead outside his home in Finchley, North London, by an attacker who fled on a motorcycle. The killing has never been solved. Underworld accounts have offered competing explanations, including the suggestion that he was killed on the orders of a different gangster entirely after a deal went wrong. The truth has never been established in court, and may never be. Gilbert Winter was an enforcer connected to the family. 4 years before his disappearance, he had stood trial for the killing of a former British high jump champion named Claude Mosley, and had walked free after a key witness refused to give evidence, a pattern that repeats endlessly in these stories. Then, in March 1998, the same year Nahome was shot, Gilbert Winter simply vanished. He was never seen again. The underworld filled the silence with grim legends, the most famous being the claim that his body was buried in the foundations of a major London landmark built around that time. No one has ever been charged in connection with his disappearance, and the stories about what happened to him remain exactly that, stories. What is certain is that 2 men closely tied to the family's finances and enforcement both disappeared from the scene in the same year, one shot dead and one gone without trace. For years, the family seemed genuinely beyond the reach of the law. Convictions would not stick, witnesses would not talk, or would change their minds, or would disappear. The belief grew, inside the underworld and inside the police, that the Adams family had somehow corrupted or frightened the justice system so thoroughly that they had become untouchable. It was the same problem that had protected the Sabinis, the Nashes, the Crays, and the Richardsons in their turn. But the Adams family had refined it into something close to an art form, and so the authorities decided to try something that had never been done quite like this before. To bring down the Adams family, the police joined forces with MI5, the country's security and intelligence service, the organization normally tasked with hunting spies and terrorists, not gangsters. After the end of the Cold War, MI5 had been given a new role helping to fight serious organized crime, and the Adams family became one of its targets. This was a remarkable step. It is hard to overstate what it means that the British state decided the only way to catch one North London crime family was to point its top-secret intelligence service at them. It was, in effect, an admission that the ordinary tools of policing had failed. The operation was painstaking and expensive, reportedly costing around £10 million and stretching over years. The breakthrough came from listening. Investigators secretly planted hidden recording devices inside Terry Adams's home, bugs concealed in the fabric of the house, including, by several accounts, inside a sofa. For around 18 months, they listened to everything said in those rooms. What they captured was revealing, and it says a great deal about the kind of man Terry Adams was. He was clever, and he was careful. Investigators came to believe that Adams knew, or at least suspected, that he was being recorded, and that he stage-managed many of his conversations for the benefit of any future court case, saying things designed to make himself sound like a legitimate businessman who steered clear of anything illegal. On one occasion, he was reportedly caught on tape telling his advisor Solly Nahome that he did not want to be involved in a particular deal because it was against the law and he was now a legitimate man. Even in the privacy of his own home, with no one but his closest associate listening, Terry Adams was performing, building his defense in advance. That is the discipline of a man who had spent his whole life staying one step ahead of the law. And here is the punchline to the whole enormous effort, the detail that captures everything about how hard this family was to catch. After years of work, after pointing the security service at him, after spending millions and recording him for a year and a half, the authorities could not make the big charges stick. There was no murder conviction, no drug trafficking conviction. The single charge they could finally pin on Terry Adams was money laundering, in effect, the crime of handling his own criminal earnings. In February 2007, Terry Adams pleaded guilty to a money laundering offense, and the following month he was sentenced to 7 years. The man believed to sit at the head of one of the most powerful crime families in the country was brought down not for blood, but for paperwork. That outcome is the entire point of the Adams story. The fear was vast, the empire was real, but the actual provable crimes that the law could lay at the door of the boss were tiny by comparison with the legend. It was a victory for the authorities, but a strange, lopsided one. Like finally cornering a giant and only managing to fine it. The same pattern caught up with the other brothers in time. Patsy Adams was sentenced to 9 years in 2016 for a shooting. Tommy Adams was sentenced to 7 years in 2017 for money laundering. One by one, the brothers were taken off the board, and the family's grip, which the BBC noted had been weakening since around the year 2000, loosened further. The Addams family represents the furthest evolution of everything that came before. Look at the full sweep of it. Darby Sabini hid his fear business behind charity and good manners. The Nash family made witnesses vanish. The Krays used fame as armor. The Richardsons bought police officers. The Addams family took every one of those tricks and perfected them into a single, near-flawless machine, a structure so well insulated that even the combined force of the police and the security service could barely scratch it. They were, in a real sense, the masters of the old game. They understood that the secret to surviving as a crime family was never to be the loudest, but to be the most careful, the most insulated, the most patient. But that very success points to something important about the era that produced them. The Addams family belonged to a particular London, a city of neighbourhood firms, blood loyalty, and bosses who ruled defined patches of territory by reputation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That world was already beginning to change as they reached their peak. New families were rising who did not fit the old mould at all. Families whose roots reached far beyond London, whose business was tied to global trade in a single deadly product, and whose conflicts would spill far more blood onto the streets than the careful, quiet Addams brothers ever did. One of those families came from a community that had only recently arrived in the city, and their rise would announce, in the loudest possible way, that the old order was finished. Section 6. The New Arrivals. How the Arif family announced the end of an era. In the early hours of an autumn day in 1990, a security van rolled along a quiet road at Woodhatch, near Reigate in Surrey, well outside London. It was carrying a large amount of cash. Waiting for it was a team of armed men, and the men were not amateurs. Between them they had assembled a small arsenal of firearms. Their plan was simple and brutal. Stop the van, overpower the guards, and take the money. What they did not know was that the police had been tipped off. Hidden nearby, ready and waiting, was a specialist armed unit of Scotland Yard. When the robbery began, the trap was sprung. In the gunfight that followed, one of the robbers, a man named Kenneth Baker, was shot dead by police. Another, the driver of the team's vehicle, was wounded but survived. His name was Mehmet Arif, and the failed robbery on that Surrey road marked the moment a new kind of crime family forced its way into the centre of the national story. The Arif family were not like the firms that came before them. The Krays, the Richardsons, the Nashes, the Addams brothers, all of them came up from the long-established white working-class communities of London, the East End and the South and the North. The Arifs came from somewhere else. They were Turkish Cypriots, part of a community that had arrived in Britain in the decades after the Second World War, settling in large numbers in South and Southeast London. The rise of the Arif family was, in a real sense, a sign that London itself had changed. The city was now home to communities from all over the world, and the underworld changed to match. The age of the purely homegrown English crime family was passing, and the Arifs were among the first to announce it. The family had been active in southeast London since the late 1960s, rising, by no accident of timing, in the very years that the Krays and the Richardsons were being dismantled. As the old kings fell and a space opened at the top of London crime, several new groups pushed to fill it. The Arifs were one of them, and by the late 1980s they had pushed harder and climbed higher than almost anyone. One newspaper would later go so far as to call them Britain's #1 crime family. The family was large, built around a group of brothers. By most accounts, 7 of them, including the names that would become known to the police and the courts: Dogan, Mehmet, Dennis, and the brother who became the most notorious of all, Bekir. The reputation the Arifs built was one of cold professional menace and a willingness to use guns that frightened even hardened criminals. They were known for armed robbery on a serious scale, for moving into the drug trade, and for running a range of businesses set up to look respectable while serving as covers for criminal money. Where the Krays had courted fame and the Addams family had hidden in careful silence, the Arifs projected something different again, a kind of open, swaggering toughness, ruling their patch of South London through the simple, naked threat of violence. People who crossed them understood the risk they were taking. The attempted robbery at Woodhatch in November 1990 is the single best documented Arif crime, and it deserves a closer look because it captures everything about the family at the height of their power and the beginning of their fall. Two of the brothers, Mehmet and Dennis, were directly involved. In a detail that sounds almost too strange to be true, members of the team wore rubber masks of the American president of an earlier era, Ronald Reagan, to hide their faces. It was a bizarre, almost theatrical touch on an otherwise deadly serious operation. They came heavily armed, carrying enough firepower for a small unit of soldiers. But the whole thing was undone before it could succeed, because the police already knew it was coming. When the armed police moved in, the robbery collapsed into a shootout. Kenneth Baker, an associate of the family who was armed during the raid, was shot and killed by officers as he moved to open fire on them. Mehmet Arif was shot in the shoulder but lived. Dennis Arif was arrested. The haul they had hoped to escape with, a sum reported at around £1 million, was never taken. The Reigate job was meant to be a triumph. Instead, it became a catastrophe, the moment the law landed its first heavy blow on the family. The two brothers involved received very long prison sentences for their part in it, removing them from the streets for years. But the Reigate robbery, for all its drama, was not the end of the Arif story. It was barely the middle of it. Because while the family had built its early reputation on armed robbery, the real money and the real danger lay in a different trade entirely, one that would define the final and most destructive chapter of their rise. That trade was the importing and selling of hard drugs, and in particular, a single, devastating substance, heroin. This is where the Arif family's foreign roots became a genuine business advantage, and a frightening one. The family maintained ties with relations back in Turkey, and Turkey sat directly on one of the main routes by which heroin traveled from its source in Asia toward the markets of Western Europe. A family with trusted blood relations positioned along that route had something the Old English firms never had: a direct, reliable supply line stretching across continents. This was the new shape of crime that the criminologists had begun to describe. Local families with global reach, rooted in one London neighbourhood, but plugged into international networks of trade. The Arifs were a textbook example. Their manor was in southeast London. Their supply chain ran to the other side of Europe. The man who came to embody this trade was Bekir Arif, known throughout the underworld by a single, memorable nickname, the Duke. Bekir had a criminal record stretching back decades. As far back as 1977, he had been imprisoned for his role in an armed robbery in which a security guard lost his life. But it was in the late 1990s that he was caught at the center of the operation that would put him away for a very long time. In 1999, Bekir Arif was convicted of conspiracy to supply 100 kilograms of heroin, a staggering quantity, valued at the time at around £12.5 million. For that, the Duke was sentenced to 23 years in prison. It is worth stopping to think about what 100 kilograms of heroin actually means, because the human cost behind that number is easy to lose. Heroin is one of the most destructive substances a person can become dependent on. It wrecks bodies, empties bank accounts, tears families apart, and ends lives. 100 kilograms of it, cut and divided and sold on the streets of London and beyond, represents an almost unimaginable amount of human suffering, addiction, illness, and death spread across thousands of people who would never know the name of the family that supplied it. This is the part of the Arif story that matters most, and it is the part most easily buried under the more exciting tales of masks and shootouts. The robberies grabbed the headlines, but it was the quiet, grinding business of the drug trade that did the most damage, and that damage fell not on rival gangsters, but on ordinary, vulnerable people. The Arifs did not operate in a peaceful underworld either. The South London of the late 1980s and 1990s was a violent, crowded place, with several families and firms competing for territory and trade, and that competition spilled a great deal of blood. The Arifs were tangled up in a wider web of South London feuding that, by the account given in one Old Bailey trial, cost around 8 lives over the course of a decade. An early flashpoint involved an associate tied to the Arif side who was shot and wounded, and the man believed responsible, a gunman named Abdullah, was himself later shot dead inside a betting shop. The cycle of attack and revenge that ran through these years was murky complicated and deadly, drawing in several different families whose rivalries blurred together into one long, bloody saga. Untangling exactly who did what to whom is genuinely difficult, and much of it was never proven in any courtroom. What is clear is that the streets of South London in this period were more dangerous than they had been in a generation. The honest assessment of the Arif family has to hold two things at once. On one hand, their reputation was enormous. Feared rivals, a newspaper crown as the country's top crime family, a name that made people across South London nervous. On the other hand, much of the very worst that was attributed to them, particularly the killings, was never established against them in court. As with the Adams family, the legend ran ahead of the proven facts. What can be stated with certainty is serious enough on its own: a fatal shootout during an armed robbery, and a conviction for trafficking a vast quantity of one of the most harmful substances known. Those are not allegations. They are matters of record, settled in a court of law. The fall of the Arif family followed the now familiar pattern, but it came through a route the older firms rarely faced: the long, patient work of specialist police and customs units dedicated to drug importation. Through the late 1990s and into the years that followed, conviction after conviction stripped the family of its leadership. Bekir's 23 years. The long sentences from the Reigate robbery. Other brothers jailed for other crimes. One by one, the men at the center of the operation were taken off the streets, and by the early 2000s, the family that had once been called Britain's most powerful was being described as a spent force, a shadow of what it had been. Bekir Arif himself was not done with crime even then, picking up further sentences in later years for a counterfeit currency operation and another drugs conspiracy, a man who seemed genuinely unable to leave the life behind. The Arif family marks a real turning point in this whole story, and it is worth being clear about why. Every family covered so far, Sabini, Nash, Cray, Richardson, Adams, belonged, in the end, to an older London. They were neighbourhood firms built on protection, on territory, on local reputation, on the slow business of squeezing money out of the streets they controlled. The Arifs kept some of that, the territory, the reputation, the family structure, but they bolted onto it something new and far more dangerous: an international supply line feeding a global drug trade. They were the bridge between two eras, one foot in the old world of the manor and the armed robbery, the other in the modern world of cross-border trafficking and mass-market narcotics. After the Arifs, the nature of London crime would never really go back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The South London feuding that the Arifs were tangled up in had a life of its own, and at the heart of it sat another family entirely, one whose decade-long blood feud with a bitter rival would produce the highest confirmed body count in this entire account, and a plot so audacious that armed officers ended up disguised as workmen to stop a killing in the street. Section 7. The bloodiest feud, the Brindle family and the war that cost 8 lives. The war began over a gun pushed into a man's mouth. In August 1990, in a pub called the Queen Elizabeth in Walworth, South London, a group of gunmen walked in and threatened a publican named John Daly. By one account, one of the men forced a gun into Daly's mouth, a terrifying act of intimidation tied to an extortion attempt. John Daly was the brother of Peter Daly, a serious South London criminal figure, and an act like that against one of their own could not be allowed to pass. What followed that night was not a single act of revenge, but the opening shot in a feud that would run for the better part of a decade, leave a string of bodies across South London, claim the lives of innocent strangers caught in the crossfire, and end with armed police officers disguised as workmen to stop a contract killing in a quiet residential street. At the centre of it was a family named Brindle. Of all the families in this story, the Brindles produced the highest number of confirmed deaths. And crucially, much of what happened to them was not rumour or underworld legend, but established in a British court, set down in a formal judgment by a High Court judge. That matters enormously. So many of these gangland stories live in a fog of allegation and myth, where the truth can never quite be pinned down. The Brindle feud is different. The chain of shootings, the dates, the names of the dead, Much of it was examined in court and recorded as fact. This is, in many ways, the most solidly documented chapter in the whole account, and it is also the bloodiest. The Brindles were a South London family, based around Walworth and Bermondsey, a tight network of brothers and relatives operating in the same world of South London crime that the Arif family also moved through. Their great rivals were the Dailies, headed by Peter Daly. The two families became locked in a struggle over the things these wars are always fought over: control of criminal trade, particularly the drug trade, along with territory and that strange, deadly currency the underworld calls respect. Once the violence started, it followed a grim logic that the people involved seemed unable to escape. Every attack demanded an answer, and every answer became the reason for the next attack. An eye for an eye, played out with guns, over years. The judge who later examined the feud put a hard number on its cost. He found that since the Troubles began around 1990, there had been no fewer than 7 killings connected to the two sides, and that members of the public had been shot in the reckless gunfire used to get at the intended targets. Other accounts, including the sentencing remarks in a major trial, put the toll at 8 lives over the course of the feud. Either way, the meaning is the same. This was not a one-off killing or a single shocking incident. It was a sustained campaign of bloodshed that turned parts of South London into a genuine danger zone for years. To understand how it unfolded, it helps to follow the chain of events, because the way one act of violence led directly to the next is the whole point of the story. The trail laid out in court ran roughly like this. In September 1990, the month after the pub threat against John Daly, a man named Stephen Daligan, an associate on the Brindle side, was shot multiple times. The man responsible was a gunman named Abdullah, who was tied to the opposing side. Daligan survived. Then, in March 1991, Abdullah himself was shot and killed. 2 members of the Brindle family were charged with that killing, stood trial, and were acquitted in 1992, found not guilty by the court. So already, within months, the pattern was set. An associate shot, the shooter killed in return, and a trial that ended without a conviction. The cycle was turning, and it was about to claim one of the Brindle brothers themselves. In August 1991, a Brindle brother named David Brindle was at a pub in Walworth. By the account given in court, 2 unidentified men walked in and shot him dead. But David Brindle was not the only person killed that day. A completely innocent member of the public, a man named Stanley Silk, was also shot and killed in the attack. Silk had nothing to do with the feud. He was simply in the wrong place, an ordinary man whose life was ended by a war he had no part in. His death is one of the most important facts in this entire story, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The feud did not just kill criminals, it killed bystanders. The recklessness of the violence, gunmen opening fire in public places to reach their targets, meant that ordinary people died. That horror was repeated in 1994, in perhaps the most senseless episode of the whole feud. A gunman, sent to kill targets connected to the rival side, got the wrong men. 2 innocent people, a father of 4 named Mike McCormack and his business partner John Ogden, a father of 1, were shot dead while having a quiet lunchtime drink in a pub in Balham. They were killed because they happened to resemble the intended targets. 2 completely uninvolved men, with families and ordinary lives, gunned down by mistake in a case of catastrophic misidentification. If anyone ever needs proof that these gangland wars are not glamorous, not victimless, not contained to the people who choose that life, the deaths of McCormack and Ogden provide it. They are among the genuine innocents in this story, and their names should not be lost beneath the names of the gangsters. Among the other casualties of the broader violence was a notorious figure named James Moody, a hardened criminal and former enforcer who had once been an escaped prisoner on the run for years. Moody was shot dead in 1993. Even Frankie Fraser, the aging former enforcer of the Richardson gang from decades earlier, was wounded in one attack connected to this period of South London bloodshed. A strange thread linking the violence of the 1990s all the way back to the torture gang of the 1960s. The feud touched everyone in that world, old and new. By the mid-1990s, the killing showed no sign of stopping, and it built toward the single most extraordinary episode of the entire saga, a case so unusual that it ended up examined in detail by the High Court. This was the attempt on the life of Tony Brindle, another of the Brindle brothers, and the remarkable police operation that stopped it. The story begins not in London, but in Dublin. In early 1995, a man named Michael Boyle was arrested in Ireland on an unrelated matter and became an informer for the Irish police. While giving information, Boyle revealed something alarming. A plot was underway to kill members of the Brindle family in London. The plot, he said, traced back to Peter Daly, who wanted the Brindle brothers dead, and it ran through serious criminal connections in Dublin. What Boyle did not tell the Irish police, at least not fully, was that he himself was lined up to be the gunman. The Irish police told Boyle to step back from the whole thing and distance himself, and they passed what they knew onto the authorities in London. That information set off a careful and tense police operation in London, run by a specialist regional crime squad. They put Boyle under surveillance. They identified a property tied to the Daly side that was being used in connection with the plot, and inside such a safe house, investigators would later find guns and explosives. Crucially, the police made a difficult and controversial decision. They chose not to warn Tony Brindle that his life was in danger. Their reasoning, explained later in court by a senior officer, was that telling the Brindles would almost certainly trigger a violent response, a preemptive strike by the Brindle side, and the bloodshed would simply escalate further and move beyond police control. So they kept the intended victim in the dark and instead set a trap. On the 20th of September 1995, Michael Boyle made his move. The location was Christopher Close, a residential street in Rotherhithe, southeast London, where Tony Brindle lived. Boyle had prepared carefully. He wore a wig to disguise himself. He used a stolen van, which he had modified for the attack, removing a wing mirror and setting himself up inside so that he could fire from within the vehicle, broadening his field of fire. He parked near Brindle's car and waited, armed with a powerful semi-automatic pistol. What Boyle did not know was that the police were already there. 2 armed marksmen from Scotland Yard's firearms unit were hidden inside another van nearby, and they were disguised as workmen from the gas company. It is a detail that sounds like something from a film, but it is recorded fact, captured on video and examined in court. When Tony Brindle came out of his home and walked toward his car, Boyle opened fire, hitting him several times, in the elbow, the chest, and the thighs. Brindle, badly wounded, managed to turn and run back toward his house. Boyle, by the prosecution's account, was intent on finishing the job and moved to chase him. That was the moment the disguised officers acted. They emerged from their van, challenged Boyle, and when he did not stop, they opened fire. Between them, they fired 14 rounds, striking Boyle 5 times. Both men, the gunman and his target, were seriously wounded, taken to separate hospitals, and survived. The entire dramatic sequence had been filmed by the surveillance operation, and on the video the shouts of the officers moving in could be heard as Boyle was brought down. A contract killing, planned across 2 countries, set to play out in a quiet London street, had been stopped at the last possible second by armed police pretending to be gas workers. Michael Boyle stood trial at the Old Bailey for the attempted murder of Tony Brindle. He denied it. The jury did not believe him. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge, the Recorder of London, Sir Lawrence Verney, ordering that he serve a minimum of 15 years. The judge's words at sentencing captured the whole grim affair. He spoke of a feud that had lasted many years and cost 8 lives, and said it was something close to a miracle that Boyle's actions had not made it 9. He added a sharp judgment on the nature of the crime itself, observing that of all types of killer, the contract killer, the man willing to take a life for payment, must be regarded as the worst. The Brindle feud is the bloodiest single story in this entire account, and it is worth being precise about why it matters so much. It is not the most famous. The names Brindle and Daly mean nothing to most people, while the Crays are known around the world. But fame, as this whole story keeps showing, is a poor measure of harm. The Crays were convicted of 2 killings. The Brindle-Daly feud, by the finding of a court, cost 7 or 8 lives, including, and this is the part that should never be smoothed over, at least 3 completely innocent people: Stanley Silk, shot beside David Brindle, and Mike McCormack and John Ogden, gunned down in a pub because they resembled someone else. The deadliest families, it turns out, are very often not the celebrated ones. They are the ones whose wars burned quietly through ordinary neighborhoods, taking ordinary people with them. There is one more thread in the Brindle story worth holding on to, because it points toward where this whole history was heading. The plot to kill Tony Brindle did not stay within London, or even within England. It reached across the Irish Sea, pulling in criminal figures and a hired gunman from Dublin, tangled up with informers and cross-border crime. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The old London feud, fought over a South London manor, had become an international operation. That widening reach, crime that no longer respected the boundaries of a single city or even a single country, was the shape of things to come. The neighborhood firm was giving way to something larger, more connected, and harder to see. And the families who understood that shift earliest were already building empires designed not for fame, but for the one thing every family in this story ultimately wanted: to never be caught at all. Section 8. Too big to bring down. David Hunt and the crime boss the law could not convict. In the summer of 2013, a High Court judge in London did something almost unheard of. He looked at a man who had no convictions for violence, no convictions for murder, no convictions for drug dealing, a man who presented himself to the world as a respectable, self-made property millionaire, and he ruled, in a formal written judgment, that it was reasonable to describe this man as a violent and dangerous criminal and the head of an organized crime group linked to murder, drug trafficking, and fraud. The man's name was David Hunt, and the way that ruling came about is one of the strangest and most revealing stories in the entire history of London's crime families. Because David Hunt was not put in that position by a prosecutor trying to lock him up. He was put there by himself. He had walked into court of his own free will as the person bringing the case, and he lost. David Hunt was born in April 1961 in Canning Town, a tough dockside district in the East End of London. He was the youngest of 13 children. Standing 6 feet 5 inches tall, he earned a nickname that followed him through the underworld for the rest of his life: the Long Fella. Like so many of the men in this story, he started young and started local. In the mid-1980s, he became involved with a street gang in East London and Essex that specialized in hijacking lorries, stealing entire truckloads of goods. According to police intelligence, several members of his own family were already part of that crew, and Hunt and one of his brothers were identified as among its leaders. From those beginnings, over the following decades, he built something far larger. The police came to call it the Hunt Syndicate. What made the Hunt Syndicate different from the families that came before was the era it grew up in and the kind of operation it became. This was crime built for the modern world. Hunt was, on paper, a legitimate businessman. He owned property, a great deal of it, along with a waste recycling business and various pubs, restaurants, and other ventures. He lived in a large country mansion on the edge of Essex, complete with a swimming pool and a tennis court. To the outside world, and to the tax authorities and the banks, David Hunt looked like a wealthy property tycoon who had done well for himself. Underneath that surface, according to years of police intelligence and journalism, sat a sprawling criminal network involved in violence, fraud, the sex trade, and money laundering, stretching across London and into the neighbouring county of Essex. This was the final form of the lesson every family in this story had been learning across the decades. Darby Sabini hid behind charity. The Crays hid behind fame. The Addams brothers hid behind careful silence and layers of insulation. David Hunt hid behind something even harder to see through: the appearance of total legitimacy, a property empire, a waste business, bank loans, tax affairs. He did not look like a gangster at all. He looked like a successful entrepreneur, and that respectable surface was, by the account established in court, the most effective disguise any London crime family had ever worn. For years, the law could not touch him, and the reasons why go to the dark heart of this whole subject. The police themselves, in their own internal intelligence reports, came to describe Hunt's organisation as too big and too dangerous to take on. an extraordinary admission that a crime group operating on their own doorstep had grown beyond their ability to dismantle. Part of the reason, according to those same reports and later journalism, was the oldest weapon in the book: corruption and intimidation. The Hunt Syndicate was said to have survived for more than 20 years, partly through the help of corrupt police officers who tipped it off and shielded it, and partly through the relentless intimidation of anyone who might give evidence against it. It is the same story that runs through every chapter: the Richardsons bribing officers, the Crays silencing witnesses, the Adams family allegedly corrupting the justice system. Hunt's organization, by these accounts, simply did it for longer and more successfully than almost anyone. One case shows exactly how it worked, and why convictions were so hard to come by. During a covert police operation, investigators had managed to plant a listening device in a car showroom. That device picked up evidence of an attack carried out by David Hunt himself, the slashing of a man's face. The victim was named Paul Kavanagh, who had upset one of Hunt's associates. Hunt was arrested and charged over the attack. It looked for a moment like the law had him, and then the case collapsed, for the reason these cases almost always collapse. The victim withdrew his statement to the police and would not give evidence. A High Court judge would later find that Hunt had intimidated the man into staying silent. So here was a crime caught on a police recording, with a named victim and a named attacker, and still it could not be turned into a conviction, because the witness was too frightened to speak. That single case is a perfect miniature portrait of why men like Hunt stayed free for so long. The breakthrough, when it finally came, did not come from the police at all. It came from a journalist. A reporter for a national Sunday newspaper named Michael Gillard had been investigating David Hunt for years, working in large part from leaked confidential police and crime agency documents. In 2010, the newspaper published its findings, describing Hunt as a violent underworld figure at the head of a criminal network so large that the police regarded him as beyond their reach. It was a bold thing to print. In Britain, accusing someone in public of being a serious criminal, when they have never been convicted of those crimes, is legally dangerous, because the person can sue for libel. To win such a case, the newspaper would have to prove, to a court's satisfaction, that what it had printed was substantially true. The risk was enormous. If the paper lost, the costs and damages could run into a fortune, and David Hunt did exactly what the law allowed him to do. He sued. He took the newspaper to the High Court, demanding that it answer for calling him a crime boss. On the surface, it was the act of an innocent man defending his good name. His barrister painted him in court as a misunderstood property tycoon, a rough diamond whose only real passions in life were his family and his racing pigeons. It was a carefully drawn picture of an ordinary, decent businessman wronged by a reckless newspaper. The trial itself revealed just how frightening the reality behind that picture was. The newspaper, fearing for the safety of the people who would speak against Hunt, hired 5 professional bodyguards to protect its witnesses. And then something extraordinary happened. On the second day of the trial, those bodyguards walked off the job, after being approached by people in a pub. A second security firm then refused to take the work at all because of the fearsome reputation of the Hunt Syndicate. Think about what that means. Professional, paid bodyguards whose entire job is to stand firm in dangerous situations abandoned a court case because the name attached to it was too frightening to be near. That single fact says more about the real power of David Hunt than any list of allegations ever could. The case largely rested on the leaked police and crime agency documents and the picture they painted. When the British state had got wind that the newspaper held these secret files, the police had even tried, unsuccessfully, to sue the paper to get them back and to stop their publication. A tangled situation that hinted at just how much the authorities did not want this material aired in open court. But aired it was, and in July 2013 the judge, Mr. Justice Simon, delivered his ruling. He found in favour of the newspaper. He decided that its description of David Hunt was substantially true, that it was reasonable to call him a violent and dangerous criminal and the head of an organised crime group linked to murder, drug trafficking, and fraud. Hunt had brought the case to clear his name, and instead a senior judge had used the full authority of the High Court to confirm, in public and in writing, that he was a crime boss. It was a stunning outcome, and a genuinely unusual one. Stop and consider the strangeness of it. David Hunt has never been convicted of murder. He has never been convicted of drug trafficking. He has never been convicted of running an organized crime group. His actual criminal convictions are relatively minor by the standards of this story. And yet a British court has formally declared him to be the head of a violent criminal network. Not because a prosecutor proved it in a criminal trial, but because Hunt himself sued a newspaper for saying so, and the newspaper proved it was right. The man's own attempt to defend his reputation became the very thing that branded him forever. It is hard to imagine a clearer example of the gap between what the legend says and what the courts can prove. And in this case, uniquely, the court came down firmly on the side of the legend. The loss cost Hunt dearly in money terms, leaving him with a legal bill running to hundreds of thousands of pounds. But it did not put him in prison, and that is the crucial point. The journalist who exposed him, Michael Gillard, was honoured as Journalist of the Year for the work, and yet, because of the danger involved, could not safely attend public events in London to collect the recognition. The reporter who told the truth about the crime boss had to watch his own back. The crime boss, meanwhile, remained at liberty, his property empire largely intact. David Hunt's story is the perfect closing argument for everything this entire account has been building toward, because it shows the final evolution of the London crime family and the final triumph of insulation over the law. Every family in this history wanted the same thing in the end. Not fame, not even money for its own sake, but safety. The freedom to commit crime and profit from it without ever being held to account. Darby Sabini wanted it and was undone by a newspaper libel case. The Krays threw it away by chasing the spotlight. The Adams family came close and were caught only on a financial technicality after the security service was turned against them. David Hunt came closer still. Here was a man whom the police themselves admitted was beyond their reach, whom a judge openly called a crime boss, and who nonetheless walked out of court a free man, returning to his mansion and his businesses. The system worked, in a sense. The truth was established. And it failed, in the most important sense, because the truth changed nothing about whether the man could be jailed. That gap between knowing who a criminal is and being able to do anything about it is the thread that ties this entire story together, from the racecourse rackets of the 1920s to the property empires of today. Across a full century, the families changed their faces again and again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. They moved from blades and razors to electric shocks, from protection rackets to international heroin pipelines, from photographs with film stars to bank loans and tax returns. But underneath every version of the story sat the same hard truth. The deadliest families were rarely the most famous ones, and the most dangerous power was always the power to make the law look the other way. What that century-long pattern reveals about the city that produced it, about the people who paid the real price, and about why these names continue to fascinate long after the blood has dried, is the question that remains. Section 9. The Fortress in the Gym, the Bowers Brothers and the Canning Town Cartel. The Peacock Gym in Canning Town is one of the most respected names in British boxing. World champions have trained there. Famous fighters, pop stars and actors have passed through its doors. It sits in the heart of one of the toughest parts of East London, surrounded by grim council estates. And for the young men who grew up around it, the gym was something close to sacred, a place of refuge, of discipline, of escape from poverty and trouble. It is a registered charity. It has raised large sums for good causes. Pensioners have used it for ballroom dancing. Thousands of ordinary members have worked out in its weights room, and for years, the offices above that very gym were used to plan a string of audacious robberies, run a drug smuggling operation, and build one of the most organised East End crime networks since the days of the Krays. The men who ran it were three brothers named Bowers, and their story is the strangest blend of genuine community good and serious crime in this entire account. The Peacock was founded in 1978 by two of the brothers, Martin and Tony Bowers, in Canning Town. From the start, it was the real thing, a proper old-school boxing gym that built a fearsome reputation in the sport. The greatest names in British boxing trained there. The gym became a landmark, a point of pride for a poor and often neglected community. And the Bowers brothers, as the men behind it, grew in stature alongside it. To much of the outside world, they were respectable figures, businessmen who ran a beloved local institution and did real good for the area around them. That reputation was not entirely false. The good they did at the Peacock was real, but it sat directly on top of something else entirely. The brothers had criminal records going back years before the gym ever rose to fame. One of them, Tony, had been sentenced to 7 years for robbery as a young man. Another brother, Paul, known by the nickname Pongo, had picked up convictions for handling stolen goods and for burglary in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So crime was in the picture long before the Peacock made them well known. For a while, after the gym took off, it appeared that the Bowers brothers had turned their backs on all that and gone straight. The truth, as it later emerged in court, was that they had simply become more ambitious, and that the gym itself had become the center of their operation. To understand the Bowers, it helps to understand the world they sat inside. They were one part of what investigators and journalists came to call the Canning Town Cartel. Not a single tight organization, but a loose network of East End criminal families and firms, all operating out of the same patch of London, all connected by blood, friendship, and business. The Bowers were part of it. So were the Tibbs family, who featured earlier in this story. So, by some accounts, were the Hunts, the family of David Hunt, covered in the previous part. Around these families circled a cast of freelance enforcers and career criminals available for hire. The Canning Town Cartel was East London crime in its modern form, not one boss ruling a manor, but a web of interlinked families sharing contacts, opportunities, and muscle. It was credited by some writers with making tens of millions from drug trafficking, robbery, and worse, all while staying largely out of the public eye. Much of what was claimed about the wider cartel was never proven in court, and should be treated as the murky, half-seen thing it is. But the Bowers brothers' own crimes were established in detail, and they are remarkable enough on their own. The driving force behind those crimes was, in a strange way, the gym itself, or rather, the desperate desire to keep it alive and to build it into something far bigger. By the early 2000s, the Bowers brothers had a grand dream. They wanted to build a Las Vegas-style casino and hotel complex on a rundown site in Canning Town. It was an enormous, legitimate-sounding ambition, the kind of project that could have transformed a struggling part of East London and turned the brothers into respectable gambling barons. The problem was money. A scheme that size needed serious funding, and the brothers, for all the Peacock's fame, did not have it. And so, according to the case later laid out in court, they set about raising the money the only way they truly knew how. They started stealing it. What followed was a campaign of sophisticated, large-scale freight robberies and hijackings that stretched across Britain. This was not street crime. It was organized, planned, professional theft, run from the offices above the Peacock Gym between 2002 and 2003. The gang targeted valuable shipments of goods at docks and airports up and down the country. Locations including Felixstowe, Thamesport, and Grangemouth up in Scotland. They hijacked a lorry making its way to Essex. The goods they made off with were an oddly mundane mix of everyday products, consignments of things like food blenders, stereo systems, and even sticky tape and vodka, alongside cash. The point was not glamour, the point was volume, stealing enough valuable cargo, again and again, to fund the casino dream. The job that defined the whole operation, and the one that ultimately destroyed it, was a raid on Gatwick Airport. The target was a sum of cash held in a cargo facility at the airport, and the plan was bold and clever. Members of the gang disguised themselves as security guards, complete with a van marked up to look like a genuine security company vehicle. Dressed and equipped to look entirely legitimate, they were able to get to the money and make off with it. The bank officials did not even realize at first that the men who had taken the cash were imposters. The haul was enormous, a sum of more than £1.1 million. It was, by the assessment of both the police and the brothers' own criminal peers, one of the most brilliant and daring robberies of recent times. It was also the beginning of the end, because however clever the Gatwick raid was, the law caught up with the Bowers brothers and their gang. The pattern of robberies was traced back to them and to the gym at the heart of it all. 11 men were eventually arrested in connection with the string of crimes, and the case came before Southwark Crown Court in London. Some of the accused pleaded guilty. 2 were tried and found guilty by a jury in August 2004. And in October 2004, the sentences came down. They were heavy. Across the gang, the prison terms ranged from 7 years up to 12. Tony Bowers, regarded as the principal figure behind the conspiracy, received the longest sentence, 12 years. Martin Bowers was sentenced to 7. The dream of the Canning Town casino died in a courtroom, and the men who had chased it went to prison instead. The third brother, Paul, was not finished with the law even then. While he was already serving time connected to the robberies, he was caught up in a separate drug smuggling operation, a scheme to ship large quantities of cannabis into Britain from Amsterdam, partly run, once again, from the Peacock Gym. The offices above the boxing floor, where champions trained below, were being used to discuss drug deals. Paul Bowers picked up a further sentence for his part in that. The gym that had produced so much genuine good had, at the same time, served as the command center for a serious criminal enterprise. That contradiction is the heart of the Bowers story, and it is worth sitting with, because it resists the easy version of a crime tale. These were not cartoon villains. They built something real and valuable for their community, and they funded their ambitions through serious, organized crime. Both things are true at once. There is one more thread woven through the Bowers story that pulls it into the wider world of London crime in a genuinely startling way, and it involves a young man who trained at the Peacock while the brothers were planning their robberies. His name was Lee Murray, and he was a mixed martial arts fighter, a tough and talented young athlete who trained at the gym to sharpen his boxing. By the accounts of those who knew him there, Murray was a well-mannered young man, the kind of troubled background youngster the Peacock had always tried to help. He was not part of the Bowers gang and had nothing to do with their robberies. But the world he was moving in, the Canning Town world of hard men and big ambitions, clearly left its mark. Because in February 2006, Lee Murray went on to organize one of the most staggering crimes in British history. He was the mastermind behind the robbery of a cash depot in Tonbridge, Kent, run by a security company. The gang kidnapped the depot manager, along with his wife and child, forcing the manager to help them get inside. Once in, they held the staff at gunpoint and loaded an enormous quantity of cash into a lorry. When it was over, they had stolen close to £53 million, the largest cash robbery the country had ever seen, and at the time, one of the largest in the world. Murray fled to Morocco, where he was eventually arrested and, after a long legal process, convicted and sentenced to a lengthy term in a Moroccan prison, where he remains. The connection is not that the Bowers brothers were involved in that robbery. They were not. The connection is what it reveals about the gravitational pull of that small corner of East London. A young fighter trained at the Peacock Gym, in the same building and the same years that the Bowers brothers were running their freight robberies from the offices upstairs, and he went on to pull off the biggest cash robbery in British history. The Canning Town world produced that. It is a measure of just how deep the criminal currents ran through that one neighbourhood. The Peacock Gym, remarkably, survived all of this. It is still open today. It still trains fighters, including boxers who have gone on to real success in the sport. The thump of gloves and the slap of skipping ropes still fill the building. The community resource that the Bowers brothers built endured, even as the men themselves served their sentences. There is something almost fitting in that, the gym outlasting the crimes committed in its name, the genuine good surviving the genuine wrong. The Bowers story matters in this account for a specific reason, and it is a reason that sets them apart from almost every other family covered. Look at the motive. The Crays wanted fame, the Adams family wanted money and invisibility, the Arifs wanted the profits of the drug trade. David Hunt wanted to be left alone to build his empire. The Bowers brothers wanted something different and, in its own twisted way, almost understandable. They wanted to save and grow a beloved community institution, and they turned to organized crime to fund it. That does not excuse what they did. The freight robberies and the drug smuggling were serious crimes, properly punished. But it complicates the simple picture of the greedy gangster, and it points to a truth that runs through this whole subject, that the line between the respectable world and the criminal one is often far thinner and far blurrier than people like to imagine. A registered charity and a crime syndicate operated out of the same building, run by the same men, at the same time. The Bowers brothers also represent the fully modern shape of London crime, the form it took after the old neighbourhood firms faded. There was no single feared boss ruling a manor through terror in the style of the Krays or the Richardsons. There was a network, the loose, overlapping web of the Canning Town cartel, families and firms and freelancers cooperating and competing, plugged into drug routes and robbery opportunities, hiding behind legitimate businesses. It was crime as a flexible modern enterprise, far harder for the public to see and name than the flashy gangsters of the past. And that, more than anything, is where London crime ended up at the close of this story. Not in the spotlight, but in the shadows of ordinary life. In a boxing gym, a waste yard, a property portfolio, a casino dream. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But for all the talk of empires and networks, some London families were never in the business of building anything at all. There was one East End family whose violence had nothing to do with territory, trade, or profit. Only a single insult that spiraled into open warfare on the streets. They were so self-contained and so dangerous that even the Krays, at the height of their power, decided it was wiser to leave them well alone. Section 10. The family nobody crossed. The Tibbs War and the East End Code. In January 1973, members of one East End family stood in the dock of the Old Bailey and were sentenced, between them, to a total of 58 years in prison. They were not drug barons. They had no international supply lines, no celebrity friends, no property empire, no grand plan to take over London. They had not built much of anything. What they had done was fight a war, a bloody, escalating, years-long war against another local family. And the violence had grown so far out of control that Scotland Yard sent one of its most formidable detectives to shut it down for good. The family was named Tibbs, and their story is unlike any other in this account, because the Tibbs family were not really in the business of crime as enterprise. They were in the business of not being pushed around, and that single principle, taken to its furthest and most violent extreme, was enough to make them one of the most feared families in the East End. To understand the Tibbs, it helps to set them against everyone else in this story. Almost every family covered so far was, at heart, a business. The Sabinists sold protection. The Krays and the Richardsons ran rackets and chased money and power. The Ariffs trafficked hard drugs. The Adams family laundered fortunes. Even the Bowers brothers robbed to fund an ambition. Crime, for all of them, was a means to an end, and the end was usually money, power, or both. The Tibbs were different. Their violence did not flow from a business plan. It flowed from a code, a fierce, old-fashioned, almost tribal belief that if anyone harmed a member of the family answered, no matter the cost. They were not trying to build an empire, they were trying to settle scores. And that made them, in their own way, more frightening than the families who were simply after profit, because there is no negotiating with people who are fighting for blood rather than business. The Tibbs were a large East End family, rooted in the Canning Town and Plaistow area, and like so many of the firms in this story, their strength lay in their numbers and their closeness. A tight knot of fathers, brothers and sons who would, without hesitation, go to war for one another. The patriarch was a man known as Big Jim Tibbs. His son, Jimmy Tibbs, born in Canning Town in September 1946, and one of 5 children, would become one of the central figures in the family's troubles. Jimmy would later go on to a completely different and far more respectable kind of fame, which is part of what makes the story so striking. But in the early 1970s, the Tibbs name meant one thing in the East End: a family no one, under any circumstances, wanted to make an enemy of. To grasp how the family came to be in that position, it helps to understand the moment in London's history when they rose. By the start of the 1970s, the 2 great firms that had dominated the 1960s were gone. The Krays were in prison. The Richardsons were in prison. Their fall left a vacuum at the top of London crime, and as this story has shown again and again, a vacuum never stays empty for long. New firms scrambled to fill the space, and the East End grew unstable and dangerous as rivals tested one another and old scores resurfaced. It was into this unsettled landscape that the Tibbs feud erupted. Not a struggle to seize the empty throne, but a private war that simply caught fire in the lawless gap the Krays had left behind. The war that consumed them began, by the family's own account, with a single act of disrespect, and a particularly cowardly one. An elderly member of the family, George Tibbs, who was around 65 years old at the time, was beaten by a much younger man from a rival family, one of the Nicholls. Picture that for a moment, a man in his 60s, set upon by someone in his early 20s. To a family built on the principle that you protect your own and answer any insult, this was intolerable. It demanded a response, and the response, once it came, set off a chain of retaliation that would run for years, each act of violence answered by another, neither side willing to be the one to back down. It was, in the family's own words, a war, but not the kind of underworld turf war fought over territory or trade. It was a private war, a blood feud, fought purely over the principle that the family would not be touched. What followed was a grim catalogue of tit-for-tat violence that tore through the East End. Guns, knives, and clubs all came into play. One of the rival Nicholls brothers was wounded with a shotgun. An associate of the rival side, a man named Len Kersey, was attacked so savagely that he was left for dead. He survived, but only barely. And the violence cut both ways, because feuds always do. One of the Tibbs brothers, a man named Bob, had his throat slashed and very nearly died. The attacks grew more reckless and more dangerous with each round. This was not the cold, calculated violence of the Richardsons' mock courtroom or the professional planning of an armed robbery. It was raw, furious, personal violence, the kind that erupts when two families decide that pride matters more than safety and that every wrong must be repaid. The single most shocking moment of the whole feud, and the one that shows just how far out of control things had spun, involved a bomb. A car belonging to the Tibbs family was rigged to explode, and the blast nearly killed Jimmy Tibbs along with his young son. A child, very nearly killed by a car bomb, in a feud over a beating. It is worth pausing on that, because it strips away any romance the story might otherwise carry. Whatever code of family honor the Tibbs believed they were upholding, the reality was a bomb that could have killed a little boy. The feud had reached a point where children were in mortal danger, where ordinary East End streets had become places where cars exploded. This was no longer something the authorities could treat as gangsters quietly settling their own affairs. It was open, escalating warfare that threatened anyone nearby, and it had to be stopped. The man sent to stop it was Detective Chief Superintendent Bert Wickstead, one of the most celebrated and feared police officers of the era. Wickstead led Scotland Yard's Serious Crime Squad, and he had earned a formidable reputation as a man who broke up the gangs that rose to fill the space left by the fall of the Krays and the Richardsons. His methods were old-fashioned and relentless, built on deep research into the families he targeted, patient gathering of evidence, and a willingness to take on outfits other officers found too dangerous to touch. Before the Tibbs feud landed on his desk, he had already dismantled another East End outfit, the Dixon Gang, a group led by a small, sharp figure nicknamed Little Caesar, which Wickstead pursued over claims of extortion, blackmail, and intimidation, sending its members to prison for varying terms. The Dixon case had sharpened his reputation as the man the Yard turned to when a London firm grew too powerful. The Tibbs job, by his own account, was a far more serious matter, precisely because the violence was so dangerously out of hand. Where the Dixon Gang had been about money squeezed through fear, the Tibbs feud was about bombs and shotguns and slashed throats on residential streets. Wickstead understood that this was not just about catching criminals, it was about sending a message to the entire underworld that this kind of open, bomb-throwing warfare would not be tolerated on London streets. The Tibbs family became the example he made. He would go on, after them, to take on other targets, including a West End vice syndicate, cementing a reputation as the gangbuster of his generation. But the Tibbs case was among the cases that defined him, because of how raw and how public the violence had become. The investigation led to arrests, and then to that mass sentencing at the Old Bailey in January 1973, where the family received prison terms totaling 58 years between them. A couple of the Tibbs brothers were convicted of attempted murder, reflecting the seriousness of the violence they had carried out. Jimmy Tibbs himself was handed a 10-year sentence, and in one of the more debated outcomes of the case, the patriarch, Big Jim Tibbs, was sentenced to 15 years for perverting the course of justice, a heavy sentence that the family would long feel was unfair, given that, in their eyes, the rival side had escalated the feud just as much and faced far less. That sense of grievance points to one of the genuine complications of the Tibbs story, and it deserves honesty. The version of events presented in court cast the Tibbs firmly as the aggressors and the Nichols side as the victims, but the Tibbs themselves always maintained that the violence ran both ways, that they were responding to attacks as much as launching them, and that some of the worst things done to their own family were never properly answered for. The truth of a feud like this is genuinely hard to untangle, because both sides committed real violence, and both sides told the story in the way that suited them. There is one detail about the Tibbs family that elevates them from a local feud into something close to legend, and it comes from Bert Wickstead himself. When the detective researched the family's background, he came to a striking conclusion, which he recorded in his memoirs. The Krays, the most feared firm in the East End, had never tried anything with the Tibbs. They kept clear of them entirely. Think about what that means. The Kray twins, who ruled the East End through terror, who shot and stabbed their rivals, who frightened an entire city into silence, those same twins decided that the Tibbs family was best left alone. The reason, by most accounts, was simple. The Tibbs offered allegiance to no one and accepted protection from no one. They were entirely self-contained. If they had a problem, they dealt with it themselves, with their own hands, and they would meet any threat with overwhelming force. A family like that is, in a strange way, harder to handle than a rival firm, because there is nothing to bargain with and no fear to exploit. The Tibbs could not be bought, could not be intimidated, and would not stay down. Even the Krays, it seems, decided that was a fight not worth having. That detail captures the essence of what made the Tibbs family unique, and why they belong in this story despite never building the kind of criminal empire the other families did. Their power was not financial. It was not built on rackets or drugs or territory. It was built on a reputation for absolute, unflinching willingness to defend their own, whatever the cost. In the world of the East End, where reputation was a kind of currency, that made them genuinely formidable. They were the family nobody crossed, not because they controlled the most lucrative trade, but because the price of crossing them was simply too high. The aftermath of the Tibbs story contains one final twist that sets it apart from almost every other tale in this account, and it is a hopeful one. To understand it, it's important to know what Jimmy Tibbs had been before the feud swallowed his early life. He was a genuinely promising professional boxer. He had taken up the sport as a boy of 11, turned professional in 1966, and built a strong record of 17 wins, 2 losses, and a draw, with 13 of those wins coming by knockout. In one extraordinary moment that made newspapers around the world, the young Tibbs shared a ring with Muhammad Ali, sparring with the greatest heavyweight of all time at a London venue, and, by his own cheerful telling, catching Ali with a light jab that sent him theatrically to the canvas for the cameras. A few weeks later, Tibbs fought on the undercard of one of Ali's bouts at the Arsenal football stadium in front of a vast crowd. He was, by every account, a fighter tipped for real things. And then the feud consumed it all, and a promising boxing career ended in a prison cell. But that was not the end of his story. After serving just under 5 years of his sentence, and after a spell working in the family scrap business, Jimmy Tibbs found his way back to boxing, this time not as a fighter, but as a trainer. The opening came almost by chance. Walking to a gym near his Canning Town yard, he reconnected with an established trainer who, heading off to America, asked Tibbs to look after his stable of fighters for a few weeks. Within 6 months, Tibbs had his trainer's license, and from there, he built one of the most distinguished training careers in the history of British boxing. He worked the corners of some of the biggest names the country ever produced, fighters including Frank Bruno, Barry McGuigan, Lloyd Honeyghan, Michael Watson, Nigel Benn, Chris Eubank, and, decades later, a new generation including Billy Joe Saunders. He guided 4 fighters to world titles. He battled through cancer and kept working. In October 2023, in his late 70s, he was honored with an award for outstanding services to boxing, a recognition of a lifetime spent shaping champions. The young man who had been at the center of one of the East End's bloodiest family feuds rebuilt his life completely, channeling whatever drive had once gone into the war into the honest, demanding craft of training fighters. He has spoken, in later years, of his regret, of wondering how much more he might have achieved in the ring had he kept out of trouble. It is a genuine redemption, and it is rare in these stories. Most of the men in this account ended in prison, in early graves, or as faded names clinging to old reputations. Jimmy Tibbs ended as a respected, even beloved figure in a legitimate sport, proof that the pull of that world, however strong, could be broken by a person determined enough to break it. The Tibbs family rounds out this story precisely because they are the exception that illuminates the rule. Every other family here was, in the end, an enterprise, a business built on extracting money through fear, drugs, robbery, or fraud. The Tibbs remind us that the London crime family was never only about profit. Sometimes it was about something older and more primal: family, pride, loyalty, and the refusal to be pushed around, taken to a point where those values curdled into bombs and slashed throats and decades of prison time. They were not the deadliest family in this account, nor the richest, nor the most famous, but they were perhaps the purest distillation of the East End code that ran, in some form, through all of them. The belief that protect your own and answer every wrong, no matter what it costs. In the Tibbs, that code burned at its hottest, and it consumed nearly everything it touched, though, in Jimmy Tibbs at least, it did not consume everything forever. Across a full century and 10 families, the same threads keep surfacing: blood loyalty, the business of fear, the masks of respectability, the corruption of justice, and the strange truth that the most famous families were rarely the deadliest. From the racecourse rackets of Derby Sabini to the airport heists of the Bowers brothers, these were not glamorous figures, but products of London's poorest streets. And the real cost was always paid by the people whose lives they ended or ruined. The bystanders, the addicts, the witnesses, the names history forgets. The era that produced them has largely closed, its visible neighborhood firms giving way to hidden, international networks. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson underneath all the blood. The danger never disappeared, it simply learned to stop seeking the spotlight. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.